Chapter 1. In the Realm of Water and Spirit. Long before empires drew lines across the earth, long before names like Srivijaya whispered through the corridors of time, there was only water. Endless water, shaping the land like a patient hand, smoothing stone. The southern coast of Sumatra was not a place of conquest. It was a place of rhythm, of tides and rain, of wind through jungle leaves, of silence between storms. Here, life did not resist nature. It flowed with it. Small villages dotted the banks of muddy rivers, their wooden homes lifted on stilts above the floodplain, as if in quiet reverence to the waters below. The people were not builders of walls, they were weavers of connection between rivers, between islands, between realms seen and unseen. They knew the sea not as a danger, but as a promise. At dawn, fishermen pushed narrow boats into the glowing mist, their paddles barely disturbing the mirrored surface. In the evenings, families gathered under palm-thatched roofs, listening to the murmur of elders telling stories of river spirits, forest guardians, and the ancestors who had first followed the tides here. Rain was not a curse, but a song. It fell in great, slow curtains, wrapping the world in silver. When it passed, the earth steamed gently, as though breathing. Crops grew rich in the soaked soil, rice in terraced paddies, bananas and sugarcane curling toward the sun. Life was full, not in gold or stone, but in balance. A balance kept not by force, but by memory of cycles, seasons, and sacred paths worn by bare feet long ago. These early communities had no kings, but they had harmony. And in their harmony, something quiet was beginning to stir. An undercurrent, deep and patient, like the first ripple of an approaching tide, where rivers meet the sea at the mouth of the Musi River, where fresh water meets salt. A different kind of settlement was taking shape. It was not a city in the way we know cities. There were no walls, no towers, and yet there was power, fluid, hidden, and alive. This was Palembang. Not built, but grown, like mangroves from the marsh. Its roots stretched into the water, its canopy into the sky. Boats slipped between wooden jetties. Trade canoes docked with baskets of dried fish, woven mats and river pearls. Over time, larger ships came, carrying silk, metal, and stories from lands so distant they seemed imagined. Palembang was not shaped by kings or generals, it was shaped by water. The river carried silt to enrich the soil. It carried food and people, but also ideas. In this web of rivers and creeks, everything was in motion. Markets rose along the banks, where laughter mingled with the smell of turmeric and lemongrass. Shrines nestled into the forest edge, where incense swirled in the humid air. And beyond, in the mangrove twilight, the spirit world was said to hum, quietly, listening. For the people of Palembang, water was not a barrier. It was a bond. It linked village to village, island to island, spirit to spirit. To travel by river was not to escape the land, it was to understand it more deeply. The waterways were stories. Every bend had a name, every channel held a memory, and through them flowed something greater than any single tribe or settlement, a feeling of connection, of movement, of becoming. By the time the first foreign ships spotted its shoreline, Palembang had already become something rare, a place not anchored by earth, but suspended in flow. not a fortress, a confluence, and in that confluence a seed had begun to sprout. The first echoes of power. When the ships from India arrived, they came with hulls full of goods, cotton cloth, ivory carvings, sandalwood, and gold. But cargo was not their only offering. With every voyage they brought something subtler, beliefs, alphabets, and glimpses of distant gods. The people of Sumatra listened, not passively but attentively. They did not discard their stories or spirits. Instead, they added to them. The Indian traders spoke of Dharma and Karma. They told of kingdoms where kings ruled by sacred order, where temples rose like mountains, and where the written word held the power to make ideas eternal. Scripts like Pallava and Nagari appeared on stone tablets and copper plates. Local leaders began adopting Sanskrit titles. The concept of centralized authority, though still foreign, began to take root. A chieftain was no longer just a village guide. He could be a ruler blessed by heaven, and the forest shrine, once modest, could become a sanctuary echoing with chants and carved stone. The Chinese came too, following the silk winds and the currents of tea. They brought lacquerware, porcelain, and their own philosophies, Confucian order, Taoist mystery. These new contacts enriched the already growing network of trade and thought. But Sumatra was not swallowed by these arrivals. It absorbed them, refined them. Like river water filtering through sand, the culture of these coastlands transformed outside ideas into something new, something local, something powerful. The people were still fishermen, traders, weavers, but now they were also students of the stars, keepers of rituals, and builders of temples. They had begun to see themselves not as isolated clans, but as part of a larger story, one that reached across oceans and generations. And in that awareness, the shape of something greater began to emerge, a maritime kingdom, a center of trade and spirit. A name not yet spoken, but soon to echo across seas. Spirit and sandalwood. Long before the name Srivijaya was etched into memory, the land already shimmered with the sacred. You could smell it in the morning, the mingling of wet earth, crushed sandalwood, and the faint smoke of offerings drifting over the riverbanks. Temples were modest at first, built from wood and thatch, not stone, but they pulsed with devotion. Carved beams depicted the Buddha in gentle poses, surrounded by animals, trees, and guardians of the forest. Monks walked narrow paths in quiet reflection, their saffron robes fluttering like flame against the green. Spiritual life in this land was not confined to the temple. It lived in the paddies, where farmers paused to bow before planting. It lived in the forest, where hermits meditated beneath banyan trees. It lived in the water, where every river spirit was honored before a crossing. The early faith of Sumatra was deeply syncretic, blending Buddhism, Hinduism, animism, and ancestral reverence. There was no need to choose. The world was big enough to hold all of it. A deity from India could sit beside a forest guardian in the same shrine. A mantra could be spoken in Sanskrit one moment and whispered in local dialect the next. This spiritual openness created a foundation both rich and resilient. As kingdoms formed and rulers rose, they did so in a land already steeped in meaning. Every palace would be built upon sacred soil. Every law would echo ancient truths, and every voyage would begin with a prayer, not just for profit, but for balance. It is said that spirit walked with the people then, not as myth, but as presence. The rustle of the trees was a voice, the ripple of the river a message, the wind a companion. The divine was not distant, it was here, all around, and, from that quiet reverence, something vast and lasting would rise. Chapter 2. The Birth of Srivijaya. In the haze of early Sumatra's river mists, where water met forest and sky with quiet grace, a figure began to emerge. Still distant, still cloaked in the rhythms of myth and tide, but destined to be remembered. His name was Dapunta Hyang Sri Jayanasa. He did not rise from palaces or thrones. He came from the currents, from the places where boats whispered through mangrove roots, and the prayers of the river people floated above the tide like incense. Smoke. In a world not yet defined by borders or maps, he was a different kind of prince, one molded not by stone, but by water. The chronicles say he did not simply march, he set forth on a sacred journey, the Siddhayatra. A voyage not only of conquest, but of consecration. It was a movement of men and spirit, of oaths and omens. He led thousands on foot, by raft and by heart, through the southern swamps of Sumatra, where spirits were said to drift through the fog, and the rivers knew the names of the dead. But this was no reckless expedition. It had a purpose, a vision. Dapunta Hyang was not chasing power for its own sake. He moved as one who believed himself chosen. And the people followed, not out of fear, but of faith. Something in his presence quieted their doubts, as if the earth itself had tilted toward his cause. He carried with him not just men, but sacred objects, ritual tools, offerings to unseen forces. The journey was a ceremony as much as it was a campaign. And from the first steps of that voyage, something new began to gather, like the forming of a wave. An empire was being born, not on land but on current, not in the shadow of a mountain, but in the drift of the tide. Rituals and conquests. It is easy to think of conquest as the clash of swords and the fall of walls. But in Srivijaya's dawn, conquest was softer, stranger. It was ceremony, it was movement, it was belief made visible through act. As Dapunta Hyang advanced, he did not burn villages or raise temples. He absorbed, he arrived with ritual. At each stopping place, offerings were made, shrines were raised, words in Sanskrit were whispered to the earth, to the rivers, to the gods who lingered behind leaves and smoke. Each victory was not just claimed, it was sanctified. The Siddhayatra was a fusion of spirit and strategy. It honored the deities of the land and sea while quietly establishing rule. Resistance often dissolved before it began, not because of fear, but because of wonder. To many, Dapunta Hyang did not look like a warlord. He looked like a holy man, and what he carried felt inevitable. His conquests were measured not only in land taken, but in minds changed. Local leaders became vassals not by force, but by the pull of something larger than them, an idea of unity beneath the canopy of spirit, and so a network grew, one that moved like the rivers themselves. Unstoppable, not through violence, but through flow, through presence, through ritual. Srivijaya was not carved from chaos. It was summoned, called forth through chant, through ceremony, through the steady, sacred advance of a prince who believed the gods were walking beside him. A capital in the swamps. When the time came to root this rising power, it did not settle on a mountaintop or behind fortress walls. It settled in Palembang, a place where land blurred into water, where the world seemed always half dreaming. The choice was not weakness, it was brilliance. Palembang was a city that could not be sieged in the usual way. Its channels ran like veins wrapping around homes and shrines, hiding fleets in plain sight. Its waters moved with the tides, changing daily as if whispering secrets to those who knew how to listen. It was not just a city, it was a living thing. Here, floating markets bloomed at dawn, offering fish still wet with river mist, spices that clung to the skin, and cloth that caught the sun. Priests walked narrow walkways carrying offerings, while boats glided silently below, their passengers whispering verses to the water. The city breathed through its rivers, it defended through confusion. Outsiders could not easily map it. Attackers could not find its heart. Palembang was not a wall to be climbed. It was a maze of reflection and ritual. Temples rose at its edges, crafted not from grand marble, but from wood and prayer. Monasteries echoed with chants, and all around, the water moved, always watching, always holding. Srivijaya's capital was not meant to intimidate. It was meant to endure, to invite, to obscure. It was a mirror of the empire itself, fluid, sacred, and utterly alive. The first chronicle. In the year 683 CE, a record was carved into stone near the banks of the Musi River. It was not long, just a few lines, but in those lines was a world. This was the Kedukan Bukit inscription, the first known written trace of Srivijaya. Carved in Sanskrit, it told of a journey of Dapunta Shang, his sacred expedition, and the thousands who walked beside him. It spoke of blessings, of victory, of fate fulfilled. But more than that, it spoke in rhythm, in meter. It was not dry history, it was poetry, a kind of hymn, a song set in stone. In those characters, angular, deliberate, eternal, we glimpse a moment when myth met memory, when the movements of men became the foundations of empire, when belief stepped onto land and claimed it. The inscription is not a boast. It is a witness, a reminder that Srivijaya was never just a kingdom. It was a vision, one etched in language, in ritual, in water, and now in stone. Even as centuries passed and empires rose and fell, this tablet remained. A small, silent thing watching the river, waiting. Today it still stands. Weathered, yes, faded, but still legible. Still singing, and in its soft stone verses we remember not just a man or a march or a place, but a beginning. Chapter 3. The Empire of 1,000 Harbours. In most empires, borders are drawn across stone and soil, fortified by walls, guarded by armies, and settled by grain. But Srivijaya was not most empires. It had no great capital girdled by farmland, no frontiers etched across plains. Its kingdom was the sea. Its domain stretched not outward, but along the currents, each tide a thread, each harbour a jewel in its crown. To understand Srivijaya is to let go of land-bound thinking. It was a realm not of territory, but of connection. Its heart beat not from a single centre, but from many, from Palembang in Sumatra to Kedah on the Malay Peninsula, to Jambi and Bangka and beyond. These were not outposts, they were nodes in a living web strung together by water and wind. Where the monsoons blew, Srivijaya reached, its ships sailed where rivers emptied into oceans and where sailors stopped for rest, for trade, or for reverence. There was no line where Srivijaya began or ended. Instead, it existed wherever its name carried weight, wherever its ports echoed with the sounds of barter, prayer, and tide. The empire's strength lay in how it moved, not in conquering, but in flowing. Not in dominating land, but in mastering the lanes between. Its ships were its chariots, its sea captains its generals. But they did not spread ruin, they spread order, a watery order built not of stone and sword, but of tide, treaty, and trade. To the traveller, Srivijaya would not have looked like an empire. It would have looked like a scattered mosaic of bustling ports and quiet temples. But beneath that surface was something immense and enduring, a vision of rule that stretched across waves, guided not by iron, but by influence, spices, gold, and silk. To sail into a Srivijayan port was to step into a world of sense, shimmer, and sound. Even before the sails were lowered, the air would change, growing thick with cinnamon and cloves, sweet with nutmeg, sharp with camphor. This was no ordinary trade. This was the lifeblood of empires. The goods that passed through Srivijaya were not trinkets. They were treasures. From the islands of the archipelago came spices so rare and potent that distant kings measured their worth in sacks of silver. From inland forests came resin and wood, fragrant and sacred, and from further still, India, China, Arabia, came bolts of silk, coils of metal, jars of perfume, and rolls of scripture. Srivijaya was not just a stop along these trade routes, it was the gate, the turning point, the fulcrum through which Asia traded with itself. Indian merchants came westward with cotton and jewels. Chinese envoys arrived with porcelain and tea. Arab traders offered glass, incense, and ideas. And through Srivijaya, all of it passed. Its ports were a choreography of commerce. Sails unfurled like petals, crates unloaded with practiced rhythm. Translators walked the docks, their tongues dancing between languages. Priests offered blessings as incense curled into the sky. And above it all, the ships never stopped. Srivijaya's harbours were never still. They pulsed like a heart. But it was not only goods that moved, knowledge flowed with equal ease. Buddhist texts, medical treatises, maps, and poems all drifted across these same seas, carried in the hands of monks, scribes, and sailors. Srivijaya was not just a market, it was a meeting of minds. And in this meeting, it thrived. Guardians of the Strait, there is a place where oceans narrow, a place where the Indian and Pacific meet in a long, tight corridor of water, hemmed by Sumatra on one side and the Malay Peninsula on the other. This is the Strait of Malacca, and in the time of Srivijaya, it was the most vital sea lane in the known world. To control the strait was to hold the pulse of maritime Asia. Every ship sailing between China and India, between the Spice Islands and the Arabian coast, had to pass through it. There were no alternatives, there was no shortcut, and Srivijaya stood at the center of it. Not with brute force, but with presence, with towers that watched the water, and harbors that welcomed and warned. Every passing ship knew that safe passage depended on Srivijaya's blessing. Tribute was expected, treaties were signed. Even the great empires, Tang China, Chola India, respected this authority, not as a nuisance, but as necessity. In return, Srivijaya offered security. Pirates, once the scourge of these waters, found themselves outmaneuvered. Lighthouses rose, where the sea turned treacherous. Pilots were provided to guide foreign ships through reefs and shallows. Taxes were collected with precision, but also with fairness. Trade was not stifled, it was organized. And through this guardianship, Srivijaya gained more than gold. It gained legitimacy. It became the gatekeeper of the seas, the trusted custodian of the crossroads. Its leaders were seen not as warlords, but as stewards, ensuring that the river of trade flowed freely and faithfully. The strait did not belong to Srivijaya. Srivijaya belonged to the strait. And in honoring that role, it became unshakable. A navy of spirit and steel. To rule the seas is not to sail upon them, it is to shape them. And Srivijaya did so with a navy that few could match. But this navy was not just a fleet of ships, it was a system, a structure, a soul. Its vessels were swift and quiet, made for rivers and sea, shaped by centuries of maritime wisdom. They hugged coasts and vanished into estuaries. They carried goods, yes, but also messages, monks, and memory. And when needed, they carried warriors. But Srivijaya's strength did not rest in the sharpness of its blades. It rested in its reach. Its real power came from alliances, from vassal kings who flew its banner, from coastal towns that pledged their loyalty, from communities that saw it not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of order. This was a network built on more than fear. It was built on sacred trust. Temples across the region shared liturgy and language. Monks traveled freely, sheltered in monasteries from Sumatra to Java to the Malay shores. Ports followed common codes. Even currencies bore similar marks. This unity was strategic, but it was also spiritual. Srivijaya supported Buddhist learning. It welcomed pilgrims and funded scholars. Its kings were seen not only as rulers, but as Dharma lords, defenders of the faith. And so, its navy was both sword and scripture, both shield and prayer. When enemies appeared, as they sometimes did, Srivijaya responded not just with ships, but with silence and strength. It negotiated, it waited, it closed a harbor here, opened another there. It used the sea itself as a lever, and in that subtle, sacred control, it ruled. Chapter 4. The Dharma of the Empire. It began with the hush of wind through the palms, a soft rustling that seemed almost like chanting. Along the muddy banks of the Sumatra coast, where mangroves spread like green fingers and rivers whispered their secrets to the sea, small wooden monasteries rose, not grand, not ornate, but sacred. These were the first signs of Srivijaya's deep turn toward the Dharma. Buddhism had arrived here not with fire or sword, but like water, patient, steady, and persistent. And in these forests and riverbanks it bloomed. Pilgrims from across the region came to rest beneath palm roofs, offered rice to the monks, and found shade in the presence of silence. The teachings of the Buddha found not only an audience, but a home. Monasteries became part of the landscape, built alongside temples, shrines, and sacred groves. The walls were simple, but the purpose was profound. Srivijaya welcomed monks as honored guests. Their orange robes brightened the markets, their chants echoed through the forests, and their presence changed everything. The people saw them not as strangers, but as reminders of balance, of truth, of the middle way. Even in the bustle of port cities where ships unloaded silks and spices, there was space for the sacred. Monks walked the harbors as calmly as they walked the jungle paths. And the people listened. Not just to words, but to example, to the stillness, to the presence, to the quiet flame that flickered behind their eyes. Religion in Srivijaya was not ornamental. It was lived, practiced, breathed. The Dharma was not distant, it was daily, and it spread not through force but through kindness, through ritual, through rhythm. Like the slow tide rising between the roots of trees, Buddhist practice flourished because it made sense in a world ruled by water and wind. It mirrored nature. It offered peace without conquest, truth without fear. And in the humid stillness of dawn, the gongs of temples rang across the land, calling all beings to wakefulness, not in body, but in spirit. The voice of Nalanda Farge. Beyond the harbours and forests of Srivijaya, across the Bay of Bengal and the curve of the Indian subcontinent, lay a place known as Nalanda, a sacred city of thought, a haven of learning. Here, in towering libraries and quiet courtyards, the finest Buddhist minds gathered, monks, teachers, and seekers of truth, and from across the sea, Srivijaya came to them. Envoys were sent, bearing gifts of gold and camphor. Letters written in Sanskrit travelled between kings and abbots, and more than once Srivijayan monks made the journey themselves, braving storms, language, and distance to reach the cradle of Mahayana thought. They did not come to conquer, they came to learn, to bow before wisdom, to ask questions that had no answers. And Nalanda opened its arms. It is said that the scholars of Srivijaya were welcome not as students, but as brothers. They debated doctrine, copied sutras, and brought news from their distant empire. Nalanda was a place where ideas moved like rivers, and Srivijaya became one of its tributaries. But the relationship was not one-sided. As much as Srivijaya learned, from Nalanda it also gave. The presence of Southeast Asian monks reminded Indian teachers of how far the Dharma had spread, of how vast its reach had become, and Srivijaya, with its peace, its wealth, and its reverence, stood as proof that Buddhism could flourish not only in deserts and hills, but on islands kissed by rain. One monk in particular would carry this connection further than any other. His name was Yijing, a Chinese traveller who stopped in Srivijaya on his way to India and stayed for years. He found there a depth of knowledge that rivaled even Nalanda itself. And in his writings, he praised Srivijaya as a place of serious learning, of monastic discipline, and of spiritual sincerity. The Dharma had crossed oceans, and Srivijaya was now its bridge. A place where East met West, not in battle, but in study, in silence, in the turning of pages beneath flickering oil lamps. Sutras across the sea, the wind shifted, the sails unfurled, and with each departing ship, something sacred left the shores of Srivijaya. Not just goods, not just spices, but scriptures, sutras, wrapped in cloth, bound in palm leaf, protected in lacquered boxes. They travelled across the sea, India to Srivijaya, Srivijaya to China, and back again. It was not just a network of trade, it was a web of belief. The sea became a corridor for the Dharma, and Srivijaya was its gatekeeper. Ships that carried cinnamon also carried texts. Monks who guided traders also guided seekers. each harbor a sanctuary, each port a pulpit. The sutras flowed like tidewater, touching every coast, every corner, and Srivijaya made sure they were understood. Temples became centers of translation, monasteries became schools. The teachings were copied, taught, and passed along. No part of this was accidental. The empire knew its role. It took seriously its duty, not just to rule, but to remember, to carry the truth of the Buddha across oceans. In the process, Srivijaya became something more than a kingdom. It became a guardian, not of treasure but of wisdom. Its ships bore no cannon, but they bore clarity. It is difficult to measure this kind of power. There were no conquests, no captured cities, but there were lives changed, minds awakened, generations shaped. The Dharma does not need a throne, it only needs a voice. And for centuries, that voice came from the harbors of Srivijaya, echoing across waves and time, whispering of compassion, impermanence, and the end of suffering. The empire's inner mandala. To rule a kingdom is one thing. To align that kingdom with the cosmos is another. Srivijaya did both. In this empire, religion was not decoration. It was not separate from the state. It was its core, its compass, its reason. The kings did not rule as conquerors. They ruled as bodhisattvas, as protectors of all beings, as servants of Dharma. Their thrones were altars, their laws were teachings, their power was responsibility. This was the mandala, not just a circle on paper, but a way of life, a model of the universe reflected in rule. At its center sat the enlightened sovereign. Around him, the realms, the people, the spirits, all turning in harmony. Srivijaya's rulers were not gods, but they were more than men. They were guardians of balance. Their duty was not to expand, but to maintain, not to dominate, but to guide. Palaces were built with temples inside. Royal orders came with blessings. Even war, when it came, was framed as a way to restore harmony, not to gain land, and the people believed. They saw their rulers not as distant lords, but as part of the sacred web. Their taxes supported monasteries, their labor built shrines, their festivals honored both state and spirit. In this way, Srivijaya became more than a power. It became a presence, a rhythm, a reality woven into the lives of its people. This is what made it last. Not its navy, not its trade, but its soul. Yansi. Empire held together not by iron, but by insight, by intention, by inner peace reflected in outer order. The Dharma was not a decoration of Srivijaya, it was its heartbeat, and as long as that heartbeat echoed through the mangroves and harbors, the empire endured. Even now, though its stones are worn, and its names forgotten by many, something of that mandala remains. In the silence of old temples, in the rhythm of tide and gong, in the soft memory of a kingdom that ruled not just by might, but by meaning. Chapter 5. The Silk and Salt Currents. The Srivijaya Empire was not written in stone. It was not measured in battlements or boundary walls. It was measured in waves, in wind, and in salt. Its roots were not carved. They were whispered into, being by the sea itself. Each year, the winds would change. The monsoons arrived like clockwork, first from the southwest, then from the northeast. These winds were not simply weather, they were the empire's rhythm, nature's breath, giving life to its pulse. When the southwest monsoon swept across the Indian Ocean, ships filled with cotton, incense, and ivory set sail from India and Arabia, drifting eastward toward the islands of Sumatra and Java. As the winds shifted months later, Chinese junks heavy with silk and ceramics followed the returning breeze westward. Srivijaya thrived in these intervals. It was not merely situated along the trade routes. It was the trade route. Harbours lit up with motion as ships arrived with the tide, carrying not just goods, but questions, customs, and curiosity. Calendars were written not in days, but in currents. To miss the wind was to miss the world. From the southern tip of India to the river ports of southern China, Srivijaya served as the pivot. Goods changed hands, but so did languages. Coins passed from merchant to monk. In a single marketplace, one might hear Tamil, Arabic, Malay, and Chinese, all spoken in the shade of a mangrove tree. These roots were invisible, yet known. They did not appear on maps, yet every sailor could feel them. And Srivijaya was their steward, its knowledge of the sea so precise that its pilots were trusted across oceans. The empire knew when to wait, when to launch, when to anchor. It did not resist the sea, it danced with it, and in that dance it held together an entire world. Traders, envoys, and pirates. Every port is a theatre, every dock a stage, and in the harbours of Srivijaya the actors came from across the known world, not with scripts, but with sails. Persian traders arrived draped in long robes, bearing lapis lazuli, saffron, and stories of cities beneath desert suns. Arabs came next, their vessels low and broad, their decks stacked with scrolls, incense, and tales of prophets and stars. From the west coast of India came Tamil merchants, with drums of black pepper, barrels of ghee, and silk dyed in the colours of sunrise. Their ships were sleek, their networks vast, their language already woven into the local tongue. Then came the Chinese, junks with broad hulls and high sails, carrying porcelain, mirrors, and bells. Their goods were precise, their envoys polite, but behind every smiling face was a court that watched and weighed. The ports of Srivijaya became crossroads where a single deal could span empires. One man sold rice to a stranger and heard stories of a drought in Gujarat. Another gifted a book and gained a map of the Philippine coast. The empire was not only a middleman, it was a mirror reflecting the desires and designs of the world. But not every visitor came in peace. From shadowed coves, pirates lurked. Some were local, rogue fishermen turned raiders. Others came from distant shores, seeking to steal what they could not buy. The waters around the Strait of Malacca grew dangerous, so Srivijaya responded not just with force, but with foresight. They built alliances with neighboring chiefs, offered harbor rights to loyal traders, and quietly eliminated threats before they grew too bold. Not every battle was fought with blades. Some were won with whispered warnings, or a gift sent to the right captain at the right time. Through it all, the empire endured because it listened. It knew every ripple in the current, every rumor on the wind, and with each passing year its ports grew louder, its reach longer, and its role deeper. The diplomacy of gifts Srivijaya did not need to conquer cities. It could win them with a box. Inside that box might be a carved sandalwood idol, its scent filling a royal hall in northern India. Or it might hold a bolt of golden silk, fine as mist, sent to a Javanese king. Sometimes it was lacquerware, glossy and red, painted with scenes of rivers and gods. These were not bribes, they were gestures, offerings made in the language of power. And Srivijaya spoke that language well. To the Khmer they sent ivory, to the Cholas, spice, to Buddhist monasteries, sacred texts copied with reverence and gold leaf. Every gift had a purpose. Every item a message, and those messages were received. The empire's envoys were trained not only in protocol, but in presence. When they arrived in foreign courts, they brought more than goods. They brought stories of a kingdom where the Dharma guided rule, of harbours that never closed, of temples rising between rivers and stars. The gifts opened doors. But it was the feeling they left behind that mattered more. The sense that Srivijaya was not just rich, but wise, not just distant, but kind. In a world where trust was rare and borders unclear, that kind of presence mattered. Even enemies respected it. Even rivals paused before challenging it. In this way, Srivijaya turned diplomacy into an art, a slow, graceful art. It sent not armies, but ambassadors. It offered not ultimatums, but unity. And while other empires burned bright and brief, Srivijaya endured like a candle in a sealed temple, flickering softly through storm and season. Letters to the dragon throne high in the palaces of Chang'an, beneath banners embroidered with dragons and cloud motifs, letters arrived. They came on silk, on bamboo, on paper, sealed with wax and wrapped in brocade. They came from the south, from the sea, from Srivijaya. To the emperors of the Tang dynasty, these letters were more than curiosity. They were reminders that far beyond the Great Wall, far across the jungles and oceans, there existed a kingdom that understood ceremony, that respected order, that played the game of empire with grace. Srivijaya's envoys entered Chinese courts like nobles. They wore robes stitched with foreign patterns. They bowed deeply. They brought tribute: gold flowers, peacock feathers, exotic animals, and spices so pungent they changed the air. But what they truly brought was presence. The Chinese records tell of these visits, of kings who styled themselves lords of the Golden Isles, of gifts that dazzled, of ceremonies that impressed even jaded mandarins, and in return the emperors responded with titles, with letters, with recognition. This was not submission. It was exchange, a ritual dance performed across centuries. Srivijaya affirmed China's centrality. China, in turn, affirmed Srivijaya's prestige. And through this relationship, the empire gained more than favor. It gained legitimacy. Traders from Java and India looked to Srivijaya with new respect. Local rulers sought its friendship. Even pirates hesitated. The letters to the dragon throne were carefully worded. Each phrase carried weight. Each gesture was measured. And through ink and incense, Srivijaya shaped the way it was seen, not as a fringe kingdom, but as a sovereign power trusted by the greatest empire on earth. In this way, Srivijaya wove itself into the political fabric of Asia. Quietly, firmly, beautifully, not with war, not with fire, but with wind and salt and silk. Chapter 6, Palembang's Golden Days. At the edge of the river where the waters turn gold at sunset, there once stood a city that shimmered like a dream. Palembang, not a name etched in cold stone, but a whisper on the breeze, a bloom unfolding. At the meeting of tide and time, it was a city of lanterns and lotus, of slow mornings and sacred rhythms, a city that didn't rise with haste or thunder, but blossomed like a flower called forth by rain. At its height, Palembang was the jewel of Srivijaya, not because it was vast, but because it pulsed with something rare, a soft brilliance, a quiet joy. Homes sat on stilts above the riverbanks, their bamboo walls catching the light. Boats drifted by with sails like folded prayers, their hulls brushed with gold leaf, glinting in the sun like dragon scales. Children played along the shore, their laughter mixing with the calls of birds overhead. Fishermen chanted blessings to the river as they cast their net, while women placed offerings of rice and flowers at shrines carved into tree roots. Monks in saffron robes paced slowly along wooden walkways, murmuring sutras into the humid morning air. The city breathed with balance. The scent of burning sandalwood lingered in the breeze. Gongs echoed at dawn. At night, oil lamps danced on doorsteps and their reflections stretched across the water like stars spilled from the sky. Palembang was not only a capital, it was a feeling of harmony, of reverence, of people living not in defiance of nature, but within it. Each day was a ritual, each corner of the city a verse in a living poem. The empire may have ruled the seas, but Palembang ruled the spirit. It was Srivijaya's heart, golden not in greed, but in grace. A marketplace of worlds. The city did not just float on a river. It floated on stories. Each market stall was a thread in a tapestry woven from across the world. Here, a Tamil merchant unrolled silk the color of rose petals. There, a Chinese apothecary prepared powders of pearl and ginseng. Malay fishmongers offered salted eels, while Arab traders laid out incense that smoked like the breath of ancient tombs. Palembang was a crossroads of cultures, a meeting point between monsoon winds. In a single square, one could hear 5 languages, smell 10 spices and witness the slow dance of trade performed with gestures more ancient than words. People didn't just barter for goods. They exchanged beliefs, rituals, tastes, and dreams. From the Malay archipelago came woven mats and carved bowls. From India came brass figurines of gods and elephants. From Persia, dyed fabrics that caught the light in ripples. From the Philippines, pearls, rough and bright. From Borneo, feathered headdresses and forest herbs. And it wasn't just the goods that mingled, it was the people. Malays and Javanese, Chinese and Arabs, Tamil and Khmer. They married, they feasted, they built homes with blue tiles and mango trees in the yard. Cuisine became the empire's true language. Rice, steamed in banana leaves, spiced coconut soups thick with shrimp and lime, fried bananas coated in honey and sesame. Each bite held the empire's essence, varied, vibrant, and lovingly blended. Markets buzzed with the rhythm of life. Storytellers entertained with fables from distant lands. Dancers moved to drums that echoed from forest to shore. The city didn't ask where you came from, only what you carried in your hands, in your heart, in your story. Palembang was empire, not by blade but by bowl, not by borders but by bridges, and each market stall was a small act of diplomacy, of welcoming, of wonder, of trust. Sacred geometry. Amid the laughter of markets and the shimmer of boats, temples rose, quiet and unmoving, like mountains. Beneath clouds, Palembang was a city of faith. But not rigid faith. Not faith that shouted. This was the faith of rivers, of stillness, of silence beneath the surface. Its temples were many. Some small, tucked beside mangrove roots, their walls soft with moss and thyme. Others grand, rising with stone and flame toward the sky. Their shapes were echoes of volcanoes. The stupa, rounded and steady, pointing gently toward the heavens. These forms were not random. They followed sacred geometry, curves and lines that mirrored the universe. The steps of a temple echoed the steps of awakening. The carvings on its walls were not decoration. They were maps of the soul. On one panel, the Buddha stood with one hand raised, blessing the world. On another, vines curled around bodhisattvas, their faces serene, their eyes half closed, as if watching both inside and out. The temples blended styles, Indian grace, Javanese earthiness, and local spirit. Elephants and lotuses shared space, with forest spirits and birds native only to Sumatra. No line was drawn between the sacred and the natural. The two were woven like threads in a tapestry. Offerings were placed at the foot of statues. Coins, flowers, bowls of water. Monks swept the courtyards with palm brooms. Children bowed low before entering. Gongs called the faithful not to obedience, but to awareness. The temples of Palembang were not fortresses. They were reflections of the people, of the earth, of the unseen. They stood not to dominate, but to remind, to soften, to center. And in their shade, the city found its balance. Knowledge and the court. In the center of Palembang stood not just palaces, but minds. The court of Srivijaya was not only a place of decisions, it was a place of study, a sanctuary for scholars, monks and astronomers who read not only stars, but souls. Scrolls lined bamboo shelves, written in Sanskrit, Pali, and local script. Some were copies of ancient sutras, others held treatises on medicine, on trade, on weather. Palm leaf manuscripts described the movement of tides, the healing power of herbs, and the precise time to plant rice under the moon. The king supported these studies not as vanity, but as duty. He was a ruler guided by Dharma, and Dharma required knowledge. Buddhist monks from distant lands were invited to teach. Local scribes trained under them, learning to write with ink and intention. The sound of chanting drifted from the palace libraries. Astrologers studied the stars to understand the seasons, the omens, and the turning of fate. Every decision in court was made with care. Not just political care, but spiritual alignment. What was just, what was balanced, what served the harmony of all beings. In this court, knowledge was not kept behind walls, it flowed. Teachers taught in temples, healers offered remedies to the sick, artists carved wisdom into stone. Foreign visitors were often stunned. They expected a kingdom of gold, Higdeman found one of thought. One Chinese traveler, Yijing, wrote that Srivijaya rivaled the great centers of Buddhist learning in India. He stayed for years, studying, translating, meditating. His words echo still. A testament to a kingdom where knowledge was sacred and scholarship was service. Palembang's court glowed not only with candlelight, but with clarity. And that clarity lit the empire far beyond its shores. Chapter 7. The Empire Expands. Srivijaya did not conquer in the way most empires did. It didn't send vast armies marching through jungles or hammerstone into its borders. Instead, it grew like the tide, gently, steadily, with presence, instead of pressure. From its heart in Palembang, the empire reached outward, but it didn't expand as a single trunk. It spread like roots beneath the sea, touching distant shores, Java, the Malay Peninsula, parts of Borneo, and even into Cambodia. These places were not seized. They were drawn in slowly, like driftwood caught in a quiet current. Srivijaya's vision of empire was not a rigid grid of cities and provinces. It was a constellation, a network of harbors, river mouths, temples, and alliances. It operated not by decree, but by rhythm. Each region remained distinct, but tied to the center, by trade, by ritual, and by shared reverence. Java offered rice and labor. The Malay Peninsula, with its highland passes and mineral wealth, offered tin and tools. From the forests of Borneo came hardwoods and animal hides, and further still, in the shadow of Angkor, Srivijaya's influence brushed against the edges of Khmer lands. Not with threat, but with thought. The empire's strength lay in subtlety. Its captains did not shout orders across distant lands. They sent envoys, they sent monks. They sent ships heavy not with soldiers, but with scrolls, spices and sacred offerings. This was expansion by understanding. The rivers didn't resist Srivijaya. The islands didn't fear it, because it didn't come to take, it came to share. It came with teachings, with structure, with a promise that local rulers could remain, so long as they bowed not to a king, but to an idea. That idea was Dharma. And under its soft shadow, Srivijaya became more than a state. It became a system. A sea-bound union held together not by walls, but by wisdom. The diplomacy of vows power is a strange thing. Sometimes it is declared with flags and fire. But in Srivijaya it was declared with folded hands and whispered vows. Local kings and chieftains did not kneel to Palembang in chains. They came in ceremony. They arrived in longboats adorned with carvings and palm leaf banners. They brought musicians and monks. And at the edge of Palembang's sacred sites, they made their vows, not to a throne, but to the Dharma. These ceremonies were not acts of defeat. They were acts of devotion, an alignment, not a submission. The visiting rulers were treated not as subordinates, but as spiritual kin, as fellow protectors of a cosmic order that was bigger than any one kingdom. Gongs rang. Oil lamps burned in rows. Offerings were made at temple altars. Sacred texts were recited under banyan trees. And when the ritual was complete, the ruler returned to his homeland, still a king, still sovereign, but now part of something larger. Srivijaya did not erase these kingdoms. It embraced them. Each alliance was built on shared belief. Each vow a thread in the greater web. Some brought tribute annually, others hosted Srivijayan monks in their monasteries. A few sent their sons to study in Palembang, to be trained not just in rule, but in righteousness. The rituals may have seemed gentle, but they were powerful. They created loyalty that no chain could match, because it wasn't forced, it was chosen. And so Srivijaya's realm grew, not as an empire of iron, but as an empire of intention. an empire where the most powerful weapon was a vow, a promise to protect balance, to uphold harmony, to rule with the steady hand of Dharma guiding every decision. Gold flowing upstream. It is said that the rivers of Srivijaya did not just flow to the sea, they flowed in reverse, carrying treasure back to Palembang. Each season, longboats arrived in procession. Some came bearing ivory tusks, polished to gleam under the morning light. Others carried baskets of pearls, still cradled in the velvet lining of oyster shells, gold ornaments, sandalwood statues, dancers dressed in silk, poets who sang of foreign kings. All these flowed into the capital like tributaries feeding a sacred spring. This tribute was not taken by force. It was given, sometimes freely, sometimes cautiously, but always with meaning. It was an offering to a center that felt unshakable, eternal. Palembang had become more than a city. It was the axis of a living wheel, the hub through which the energy of empire turned. The tribute was not just about wealth, it was about affirmation, a reminder that the outer lands still looked to the center, still listened for its breath. And with each gift came another message, that the world outside still believed in Srivijaya's vision, that the empire's order still held sway. The treasures were recorded with care. Scribes noted each item in palm leaf manuscripts. Priests blessed the dancers before they performed. Poets were given garlands and gold coins in return for their words. These offerings filled the royal court not just with riches but with rhythm. The pulse of the wider empire could be felt in each package, in each poem, in each ceremonial visit. And as long as this golden river continued to flow upstream, Palembang remained strong, not just in wealth, but in spirit. Because what truly mattered wasn't the gold, it was the connection. Not all were loyal. Even the calmest sea holds hidden storms. Even the most harmonious kingdom carries echoes of discontent. For all its grace and reach, Srivijaya was not immune to fracture. Not all vassals remained loyal. Some chafed at the rituals. Others envied the center's light. In the quiet corners of the empire, in swampy river mouths or mountain thickets, rebellion stirred. Sometimes it began with silence. Tribute delayed. Envoys turned away. Other times it was louder. A local ruler declaring independence, a harbor refusing Srivijaya's ships, a shrine vandalized in defiance. Jealousy brewed in rival courts. There were kings who had once bent the knee in ceremony, now questioning why Palembang's voice still carried so far. The old vows began to feel heavy. The gold harder to part with. And yet, Srivijaya did not rush to crush them. Its strength had never come from speed. It came from patience. The court listened. It waited. It sent monks instead of soldiers. It reminded rather than punished. It invited rebels back to the fold, not with threats, but with reasons, with stories of past harmony, with promises of shared glory. Some accepted, some did not. Occasionally, a show of force was required, a brief campaign, a warning made visible. But even then, Srivijaya preferred to forgive, to rebuild, to remind the wayward of the beauty in belonging. And, in most cases, it worked, not because the empire was perfect, but because it remembered. It remembered that power without compassion is brittle, and that an empire built on water must bend with the wave, not fight against it. So it endured. Despite cracks, despite rebellion, despite the slow rusting of certain links in its chain. Srivijaya endured, not just through strength, but through the slow, careful weaving of loyalty, ritual, and time. And though it would face greater storms ahead, in these days, it still held the tide. Chapter 8. Shadows of Java. South of Sumatra, across narrow waters where the wind smells of salt and cinnamon, there lies an island with fire in its roots and silence in its shadow, Java. For centuries, Java had watched quietly. It had traded, it had prayed, it had sent envoys and accepted monks. But now, in the days when Srivijaya still held the seas, Java stirred. The Shailendra dynasty had taken root in the fertile central plains. The land was generous, black soil rich from volcanic ash, rivers steady and kind. From this foundation rose kings who looked not outward with fear, but inward with certainty. They believed in their place in the world, and they believed in more. Their power did not appear overnight. It grew season by season, dynasty by dynasty, brick by brick, grain by grain. Java was not a land of storms. It was a land of slow thunder, patient, gathering strength. The Shailendra kings built canals, ordered crops and raised armies not to conquer, but to control. Their vision was precise. They knew that true power was not always loud. It could arrive in silence, in treaties signed without blood, in roads that crossed kingdoms, and behind their calm eyes burned a different kind of fire. They did not seek to overthrow Srivijaya. Not yet. But they watched it closely, its wealth, its rituals, its reach. And in the quiet halls of Javanese courts there began a new kind of question. What if the center shifted? What if the seas no longer listened only to Palembang? What if Java, too, could command the winds? The Tiger Island was rising. Not with claws bared, but with breath held. And the empire of Srivijaya, for the first time in generations, felt the warmth of another sun rising beside it. Temples to heaven. In the middle of Java, where fog clings to jungle and birds echo between ancient trees, a mountain began to grow. Not of stone, but of faith, Borobudur, a temple unlike any the world had ever seen. A temple that did not rise toward heaven with sharp towers or golden spires, but with steps, slow, circular, steady. Like a thought climbing toward truth. It was built by the Shailendra kings, not as a monument to themselves, but as a mirror of the cosmos. Its base held the weight of the world. Its terraces told stories in stone of lives and lives again, of Buddha, of suffering, of release. No one rushed at Borobudur. Pilgrims moved in silence, barefoot, eyes lowered. Each step brought them closer, not to the top, but to understanding. The carvings wrapped the temple like waves, thousands of panels, each one a lesson. Kings and beggars, animals and angels, ships and storms, all turning in the endless wheel. And at the summit, the stupas, bell-shaped, serene, open to sky and thought, each one sheltering a statue of the Buddha, seated, eternal. Borobudur was not just a temple, it was a statement, a message written in stone and shadow. Java was not a servant of Srivijaya. It was a rival in grace, in devotion, in vision. Srivijaya had temples too, cloaked in forest, softened by river mist. But Borobudur was something else. It was deliberate. It was dominant. It did not compete with war but with wonder. Pilgrims came from all corners, Sumatra, the Malay coast, even from as far as Bengal. And when they returned, they spoke not just of Srivijaya's sacred cities, but of a mountain that taught the Dharma through silence and stone. Borobudur shifted the spiritual center of the region, not away from Srivijaya, but beside it, and in that shift, the balance of the archipelago began to tilt. Rivals or reflections? For a time, the waters between Sumatra and Java stayed calm. For a time, two empires walked the same path, Shailendra and Srivijaya, both Buddhist, both rich, both proud. They exchanged envoys, they hosted each other's monks, they sent gifts wrapped in silk and sealed with scripture. They called each other brothers under the Dharma. They shared sutras. They aligned in rituals. And the seas flowed easily between them. But under that ease was something harder. Beneath the blessings and incense was ambition. The Shailendra dynasty, though young, was sharp. It studied Srivijaya's strength, the way it tied kingdoms together, the way it controlled trade, not through conquest, but through corridors. And it began to wonder, why not Java? Why should Palembang be the gate of the seas? Why should its monks speak for all the islands? Why should its name echo louder in foreign courts? At first, the alliance held. It served both sides. Srivijaya gained influence over Java's heartland. Java gained prestige through connection. But reflections are tricky. Sometimes they distort. Sometimes they deceive. What began as cooperation became comparison. And comparison became quiet competition. In the ports of Kedah and the temples of Sumatra, whispers began to rise. Of Javanese ships that asked for tribute without permission. Of local kings who spoke more of Borobudur than of Palembang. Still there was no open break, no battle, only a shift. In glances, in tone, in the way gifts were given and names pronounced. The question grew in the space between the islands. Were they allies, or were they echoes of each other, destined someday to clash? The quiet tug of power. Power does not always break like a wave. Sometimes it pulls like a current. Srivijaya had ruled with softness, with gongs instead of horns, with monks instead of generals. It knew how to wait, how to outlast, how to turn resistance into rhythm, but Java's rise was different. It did not attack. It encircled. It did not declare. It hinted. Its influence crept into outposts once loyal to Srivijaya. Its coins began to appear in markets once ruled by Palembang. Its princes married daughters of Sumatran chiefs. Its scholars offered new interpretations of old texts. It was not war. It was weight. The kind that bends branches without breaking them. The kind that turns tides without a sound. Srivijaya responded in its way. It strengthened its rituals, sent envoys deeper into the peninsula, renewed vows with old allies, built new temples, funded pilgrimages. It showed not fear, but focus. Yet the pressure remained. Some vassals hesitated before sending tribute. Some envoys bowed more deeply to Java than to Sumatra. The unity of the archipelago, once so certain, now trembled at the edges. Still, no battle was fought. No ships clashed on the sea. It was a chess match, move and counter-move, gesture and reply, each side waiting, watching, weighing the cost of open conflict. And in that waiting, a new truth emerged. Java would not remain beneath Srivijaya's canopy forever. It had tasted the fullness of its own power, and it would not give it back. Srivijaya remained strong, sacred, still respected. But in the quiet pull of tides and treaties, the empire felt the earth shift, not as a collapse, but as a changing of light as the shadow of Java grew long upon the sea. Chapter 9. The Burning of Palembang. The sea had always been Srivijaya's strength, its ally, its guardian, its voice. For centuries, the empire rode the monsoons like a second breath, threading its influence through every wave and inlet of Southeast Asia. But in the year 1025 CE, the sea turned. Across the Bay of Bengal on the southeastern coast of India, another empire watched the waters. The Chola dynasty, proud, ancient, and fierce, had risen to power with a vision as vast as the ocean. Its temples stood like mountains. Its navy, unmatched in the Indian world, stretched beyond local rivalries, and its eyes, once focused inward, turned toward the east. The reasons for the Chola campaign were many: trade rivalry, a thirst for prestige, a desire to assert dominance over the sea. Srivijaya, with its golden name and silken roots, was both a rival and a prize. Led by King Rajendra Chola III, an armada was prepared, not a raiding party, but a fleet of war. Ships were fitted for long voyages, packed with weapons, warriors, and ambition. These were not traders. They came not to barter, but to burn. When the Chola fleet crossed the Indian Ocean, it moved with precision. Harbour by harbour, city by city, Srivijaya's outposts in the Malay Peninsula were attacked. Kedah, Tambralinga, Lankasuka. Each one struck with the speed of lightning over calm water. And then they sailed for Palembang, the jewel of Srivijaya, the heart of its culture, the pulse of its trade. The city was not ready. For all its wealth and wisdom, Srivijaya had grown soft in its supremacy. Its walls were ceremonial, its defences symbolic, its navy scattered across a vast ocean. The Cholas arrived like a storm with no warning, and when their ships breached the estuaries of the Musi River, the age of Srivijaya's unchallenged dominance came to a crashing halt. Temples turned to ash. Palembang had always been a city of reflection, of soft lights on water, of chants rising through mist, of golden boats drifting like leaves on the tide. But when the Chola warriors came ashore, they brought with them no prayers, only fire. The burning began at dawn. Monasteries, once filled with the calm of scriptures and the rustle of robes, were turned into pyres. Wooden temples built with care and devotion caught flame and fell in on themselves. Oil lamps cracked in the heat, stone statues blackened and crumbled. The sacred geometry of the city dissolved into smoke. The smell of incense was replaced with ash. The gongs, which once called monks to meditation, were silent or shattered. Scrolls, copied by candlelight for generations, curled in the blaze, their words devoured before they could be remembered. The Cholas moved with method. They did not linger. They did not aim to occupy. They looted what they could: gold, ivory, silks, artifacts of devotion, and destroyed what remained. They were not there to claim Srivijaya's legacy. They were there to end it. Palembang's people fled. Some hid in the mangroves, others took to boats, paddling up tributaries with whatever they could carry. The city that once ruled the waves was reduced to ruin. Its markets were ash, its temples hollow shells, its spirit scarred. And yet, beneath the pain and flame, something endured. In the ruins, a monk found a stupa still standing. A child clutched a water-warped manuscript. A priest gathered ashes and whispered blessings into the smoke. The destruction was immense, but it was not total. Palembang burned, but it did not disappear. Echoes on the water, the attack did not end Srivijaya, but it changed it in ways that could not be undone. Before the invasion, Srivijaya had been the rhythm of the region, the empire that guided the tides, the voice heard in every port, the sacred link between India and China. After the invasion, it became something quieter. The age of confidence was over. Where once its name carried the weight of certainty, it now echoed with memory. Traders still came, but fewer than before. Temples were rebuilt, but smaller. The wealth returned, but slower. The empire did not collapse. It receded like a tide that had crested. Srivijaya became more cautious. It watched rather than led. It navigated diplomacy with humility, not grandeur. Its rulers, once seen as semi-divine, now ruled with a softer hand, not from gilded halls, but from prayer halls and palaces draped in restraint. The networks remained, but they thinned. Vassals, once tied by ritual, now weighed other options. Java, bold and rising, offered protection and partnership. China, once a steadfast friend, looked eastward toward new alliances. Still, Srivijaya endured, because its strength had never only been in power. It was in presence, in its ideas, in the quiet trust it had built over centuries. Its monks continued to teach. Its ships, though fewer, still sailed. The Dharma still rang through its temples, even if fewer gongs replied. And, in the scattered islands of the archipelago, the name Srivijaya still held meaning, not as a ruler, but as a root, a legacy. What had once been the sun now became the ember, no longer blazing, but still warm, still remembered, still alive. The wind shifts after the fire. The wind changed, not all at once, but in gentle, undeniable turns. Java grew bolder. The Shailendra had faded, but the Mataram and later the Singasari dynasties stepped into the open. With Palembang humbled, the Javanese grew louder in the halls of diplomacy. Their ships grew more frequent, their alliances more firm, their ambitions less hidden. Other powers stirred too. Inland kingdoms, once shadowed by Srivijaya's reach, began to rise. Cities like Tumasik, later Singapore, and early Malacca found space to breathe. The tide had shifted. The web of trade that once orbited Srivijaya began to spin its own threads. The great Chinese dynasties turned their gaze to new routes and new partners. Muslim merchants from the Arabian Peninsula and India brought not only goods, but new faiths. The world was not shrinking. It was expanding. And Srivijaya, once at its center, now stood at the edge. And yet, it did not vanish. The empire adapted. Its ports, though quieter, remained vital. Its priests continued to travel, to teach. Some parts of the kingdom became independent, others stayed loyal. The center held, but with less gravity. Palembang rebuilt, not with golden towers, but with purpose. The city's bones, though scorched, remained strong. Its people, survivors of flame, planted again, prayed again, sang again, and through them Srivijaya lived on, not as a power, but as a presence, a memory that walked, barefoot and patient, along the riverbanks of time. Chapter 10: The Age of Resilience. In the quiet that followed the fire, something softer took root. The once golden name of Srivijaya no longer glowed from the summit of empire. It no longer rang from palace gongs or echoed in foreign courts with the same certainty. The Chola raid had not just shattered temples, it had cracked the idea of permanence. But what followed was not collapse. It was transformation. Srivijaya did not vanish. It changed its shape. Without a crown to dazzle or a capital to command the waves, the empire scattered, like incense smoke, too fine to catch, too sacred to destroy. It survived in the currents, in trade winds, in the quiet rituals of merchant, captains and monks. The empire became less visible, but more enduring. Its people did not stop sailing. They did not stop praying. They did not stop remembering. Instead of rebuilding the past in gold and stone, they built something humbler, something that could bend without breaking. Srivijaya no longer ruled by the weight of its center. It became a current of culture drifting through the archipelago, touching harbors with memory and meaning. Ships still carried its style, in carvings, in coins, in quiet greetings passed at sea. Its monks still taught, its language still traveled. Its spirit, though no longer seated on a throne, remained seated in the hearts of those who had once called it home. A kingdom without a crown, but not without reverence. This was the beginning of the age of resilience, not built on expansion, but on endurance. Not rising with ceremony, but flowing with silence. The rise of Jambi, far upriver from Palembang, past the places where the empire had once burned brightest, lay a gentler bend in the land. Muaro Jambi. It was not built for kings. It had no palace gates or grand avenues. It grew quietly, as if drawn by the memory of something sacred. Trees leaned over the river. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and jasmine. And among the roots and vines, temples began to rise again. But these temples did not shout. They did not try to rival the stupas of Borobudur or the courts of old Palembang. They were smaller, simpler, made of red brick instead of stone, of patience instead of pride. Yet they held something powerful. Muaro Jambi became a refuge, a place for monks to return, for pilgrims to remember, for the Dharma to breathe again, not as an empire, but as a sanctuary. The temples here echoed with prayers rather than proclamations. The river carried offerings, not armies. The people farmed, traded, meditated, and in the stillness a different kind of power grew. This was Srivijaya's soul rerouted. Muaro Jambi did not seek to replace Palembang. It sought to preserve what could not be burned. Wisdom, humility, rhythm. It became the ember in the ashes, the candle relit, the breath after weeping. Historians debate whether Muaro Jambi was the new capital. But in truth, it did not need a title. It was not the crown of the empire. It was its heart. Where Srivijaya once reached outward, here it reached inward, and in that turning, it found peace. A network of silence. There was a time when Srivijaya spoke through gongs, through tribute, through temples wrapped in gold. But in its later years, it spoke in other ways, through silence, through symbols, through presence that did not need to declare itself. The empire became a whispering network. Its power no longer seen, but felt. At sea, merchant ships still followed routes once mapped by Srivijayan captains. Sailors still prayed before departing, using mantras first spoken in the shadow of Sumatra's temples. Coins passed hands bearing marks not of kings, but of customs. Rituals continued on deck, offerings to the ocean, chants at sunrise, blessings for safe return. All of it inherited, all of it carried forward. In the marketplaces of the Malay Peninsula, the language of commerce still bore Srivijaya's structure. Its blend of Sanskrit and Old Malay-shaped communication from Java to Borneo, from Kedah to Champa. Even in the voices of new empires, the old cadences remained. This was Srivijaya now. Not a roar, but a rhythm. A temple bell in a Javanese village, a monastery rebuilt near the coast of Bintan, a scholar copying sutras in a peninsular town that once paid tribute to Palembang. All threads in a tapestry that no longer needed a center to hold. It was a power that resisted measurement. No more boundaries, no more thrones, just presence. Presence in rituals passed down, in recipes, in festivals, in the soft shapes of stories told under starlight. Srivijaya did not vanish. It dissolved like salt in the tide, still here, still shaping the water. Lessons in letting go the greatest empires teach through victory, but the wisest empires teach through loss. Srivijaya had once ruled through grandeur, through temples that touched the sky, through fleets that turned harbors into echoes of its name. But in the twilight of its era, it taught a different lesson. Letting go, it let go of its pride, choosing peace over prideful retaliation. It let go of its monuments, allowing memory to rise where stone had fallen. It let go of control, trusting that what was meant to stay would remain, even without decree. And in that letting go, it discovered a new kind of strength, not the strength of expansion, but the strength of adaptation, not the strength of dominion, but the strength of presence. Its people, once called to court by gongs and golden edict, were now called inward, to reflect, to rebuild in quieter ways. The empire did not seek to restore its height. It did not cling to the past. It flowed with the current. Like the rivers that had always carried its truth, other empires would rise. New names would shimmer across the sea. But Srivijaya left behind something deeper than rule. It left behind grace. Grace in persistence. Grace in change. Grace in the slow, sacred act of becoming something else. And knowing that what matters most cannot be burned, cannot be stolen, cannot be forgotten. It endures not in power but in peace. Chapter 11. The Monsoon Kings. Long after the fires of Palembang cooled, After the temples quieted and the golden age of Srivijaya slipped into the folds of memory, a different kind of ruler emerged. One not crowned in ceremony or seated on gilded thrones but shaped by wind and wave. They were known not by lineage or title alone, but by understanding. The kings of the monsoon, men who governed with the sky as their calendar, the sea as their road, and silence as their command. These rulers did not raise great walls. They did not carve their faces into stone. Instead, they listened to the rhythm of rain, the shift of tides, the whisper of markets carried across the sea breeze. Their authority flowed with the seasons, not in defiance of nature, but in harmony with it. In this maritime world, power was not fixed. It moved just as the ocean moved. The monsoon kings did not rule from static capitals. They ruled from movement itself. A shift in the wind could change their reach. A shift in trade could alter their strength, but this was not weakness, it was wisdom. They understood that the world was not built to be held, only understood, guided, and released. So they ruled like sailors, with patience, with instinct, with faith in the currents. And across the archipelago, in every port that once sang the name of Srivijaya, these rulers carried its memory forward, not by conquering lands, but by mastering time. They were rulers, not just of men, but of moments, of monsoons, seasonal sovereignty. The sea is not loyal. It does not belong to anyone. It gives, and then it takes, but it also returns, and so did Srivijaya's kings, rising and falling like the tide. Some ruled for decades, remembered in the chants of temple monks and the ink of palm leaf scribes. Others ruled for only a season, their names swallowed by waves, their stories lost in the rain. But all were bound to the same truth. Power was temporary, like good weather. Each year the calendar turned not with months, but with winds. The southwest monsoon brought ships from India and Arabia, heavy with cotton, incense, and ambition. The northeast monsoon carried them back, this time from China with silk, porcelain, and stories from the distant court of the emperor. The kings moved with these winds. They held court when the harbours were full. They negotiated when markets bustled. And when the winds turned, they turned too, retreating upriver to quieter places, to await the next season. Their sovereignty was not printed on maps, it was written in motion. When the sea was calm, their authority expanded. When storms came, it retreated. They understood that a king could not command the ocean, only accompany it. And so, even in their grandeur, they remained humble. They bowed before the horizon. They watched the sky more closely than their enemies. They listened to the creak of the hull more than the shout of the court. And in doing so, they ruled, not by force, but by flow. These were not kings of conquest. They were custodians of time, the floating throne. In the world of Srivijaya's descendants, the throne was not carved from stone or gilded in gold. It floated. Sometimes it was the deck of a ship, wide and low, made of teak, bearing both cargo and command. Other times it was the wooden floor of a riverbank hall, built on stilts where fishers and priests alike could kneel. The king did not need high towers. His power came from presence. He was where the ships docked, where the markets met, where the monsoon winds whispered fortune. To rule from a floating throne was to rule without arrogance. It was to accept that control was temporary, that water could not be grasped, only followed. Qing moved as needed, sometimes to river deltas, sometimes to outer islands, wherever balance was threatened or trust required renewal. This mobility was not weakness, it was mastery. It allowed rulers to respond quickly, wisely, personally, to settle disputes between traders from Java and Sumatra, to renew pacts with coastal chiefs in Borneo, to bless a new temple built beside a forgotten cove. Their court was carried in their presence, in the caravan of boats that followed them, the sacred banners fluttering over rippling water, the scent of incense trailing behind like memory. They carried scrolls, relics, and lore. But more importantly, they carried continuity. They reminded the archipelago that Srivijaya was not gone. It had changed form. It now moved with the wind, anchoring only long enough to guide, then drifting on, not away, but forward, when the sky betrays. The kings of Srivijaya had learned to read the sky like scripture. A red horizon meant change. A sudden stillness in the wind meant delay. But there were years when no wisdom could prepare them, when the sky betrayed them. The monsoons failed, the rain did not come, or it came all at once, drowning fields, flooding, harbors, scattering fleets. Trade stalled, markets thinned, pilgrims delayed their journeys. Rituals were shortened, as drought dried the rivers that once ran like arteries through the empire. Worse than silence was suspicion. Some whispered that the gods had turned, others blamed the kings. Had they broken a vow? Had a ritual been missed? And yet, through this, Srivijaya's spirit endured. When the sky closed its hand, the people opened theirs. Temples became shelters. Monasteries shared grain. Traders shared stories of survival, not riches. The rituals changed. They grew quieter, more humble, more grateful for what remained. The floating throne, no longer surrounded by tribute, now floated with prayers, not for dominance, but for harmony. It was in these lean years that Srivijaya showed its truest strength, not in wealth, but in resilience, not in expansion, but in acceptance, because the empire had always known that water could not be tamed, and now it remembered that neither could fate. So it bowed, not in defeat, but in understanding, and when the winds returned, as they always did, Srivijaya rose once more, not higher, but wiser. Chapter 12. Crossroads of the Old World. As the sun set over the fading century, the winds of change began to blow with a quiet certainty through the old harbours of Srivijaya. The empire, once a sovereign of seas and ceremonies, had begun to feel the pull of the wider world. The compass, once pointed firmly toward the Dharma of Buddhist kings and the rhythms of Indian trade, now turned freely in all directions, to the Middle East, to China, to new, unseen powers rising far beyond the archipelago. By the 12th century, the world was shifting, slowly, subtly, but undeniably. Maritime routes redrew themselves like the shifting coastlines after a monsoon storm. China's Song dynasty was flourishing with trade, its porcelain ships carving new corridors into the ocean. The Cholas of South India, once fierce rivals, had drawn their sails elsewhere, and behind them came new figures, Persians, Arabs, and traders, bearing not only goods but languages, verses, and visions of a different divine. Srivijaya, ever a master of adaptation, did not resist. It listened, it opened, its wooden docks, soaked by centuries of salt and incense, now carried new scents. Sandalwood from Gujarat, coffee beans from Yemen, glass beads from Syria. These traders did not just unload goods, they lingered, spoke, shared tea and scripture under the shade of palm fronds. They did business by day, and by night told stories of deserts and prophets under starlit skies. The palace in Palembang no longer dictated the world's tide. Its influence had softened like the edges of a coin passed through too many hands. But its ports, they still pulsed. The city remained a junction, a place where cultures didn't just pass through, but wove themselves into the silk of the streets. Monks and imams sometimes walked the same roads. A Buddhist stupa stood not far from a mosque's rising foundation. Srivijaya was no longer the only gate to the islands, but it was still a place where paths met. Its compass spun freely, and wherever it pointed, something new arrived. The scent of Arabia. From across the Arabian Sea, down the curve of the Bay of Bengal, and through the Strait of Malacca, came vessels with names whispered in unfamiliar syllables. Their sails were lateen, triangular like the wings of seabirds, and their captains spoke in tongues that curled like incense smoke, Arabic, Persian, Swahili. These were not armies. They bore no banners of conquest. They carried spices, yes, pepper, cardamom, cloves, but also something far more enduring: language, memory, and faith. They carried verses of the Quran, handwritten on parchment, tied with string, wrapped in linen. Some brought small prayer rugs, others beads for dhikr, the rhythmic remembrance of God. At first, they were strangers, but the ports of Srivijaya were used to strangers. That had always been their strength. The newcomers were offered food, water, a place to rest. They traded stories before they traded coin, and slowly their presence became familiar. The merchants were not missionaries, they were patient. They spoke of Mecca as one might speak of a beloved homeland, distant yet alive in every gesture. Some married local women. Some stayed for months, even years. Children were born with Arab names and Malay faces. Along the riverbanks, the call to prayer, soft and echoing, began to rise just before dawn. But the older chants remained. The monks still recited sutras in candle-lit monasteries, their voices rising like mist over the lotus ponds. The two sounds, the Sanskrit invocations and the Arabic ayahs, lived side by side. Sometimes they crossed. A trader might bow before both altars, hoping to find peace in both names of God. It was not a war of faiths, it was a quiet unfolding. One where belief moved not through battles but through breaths, through the hands that passed water, the mouths that offered blessings, the hearts that opened not out of fear, but curiosity. Srivijaya, in its twilight, became not a battlefield of religions, but a garden of them, and from the scent of Arabian spices came the first hint of a new spiritual wind. A new tongue, a new prayer. Language had always been a living thread in Srivijaya, woven from Sanskrit, Pali, Tamil, and Old Javanese. Words carried weight, carried power. They chanted the cosmos into order, named kings and gods, wrote treaties and carved mantras into stone. But now something different moved through the air. Malay, the tongue of markets and mariners, began to change, not all at once, not by decree, but like water shaping rock, slow and persistent. New phrases entered its flow. Salam, Rahmat, Insha'Allah. The rhythm of speech bent slightly, like a boat turning gently to catch a new wind. The Xt courts may have remained Buddhist in symbol, but the streets whispered differently. Along alleyways and beside the wharves, children played with names like Hassan and Amina. At night, men gathered in wooden huts with lanterns and listened as a traveller read aloud from the Quran, not always understanding the words, but feeling the melody settle deep in their bones. Some locals began to fast during the holy month of Ramadan. Others adopted Arabic names at birth. Mosques, simple at first, wooden and thatched, began to rise beside the older temples. The imam and the monk might meet in the same spice market, nodding in mutual respect. Islam was not imposed. Arrived like rain in the dry season, welcome, needed, natural. And in its coming, the language bent toward it. New words held new meanings. Ilmu for knowledge, adab for conduct, tawheed for oneness. The transformation was not just religious, it was cultural, philosophical. The Malay world began to imagine itself differently, no longer just as a vassal of India or a cousin of Java, but as something distinct, something born of many rivers, many prayers, many verses. And in this transformation, Srivijaya's voice did not vanish. It changed pitch. It grew softer, deeper, more layered, like an old song sung in a new key. Port, not empire. By the 13th century, the empire of Srivijaya had all but faded. The great fleets no longer sailed under its name. The royal seals were worn, the palaces quiet. New powers had risen. The Javanese, kingdoms, the rising sultanates, the traders of Malacca. History had shifted its gaze, but Srivijaya was not forgotten, and more importantly, it was not gone. For in its harbours something lingered, a spirit, a rhythm, a memory dressed in the sounds of haggling merchants, the creak of mooring ropes, the splash of oars on water. Srivijaya was no longer an empire, but it was still a place, a port, a presence. The city of Palembang remained a meeting point, where Chinese junks and Arab dhows still unloaded their silks and spices. The temples were quieter now, but they still stood, weathered and watching. The mosques rang out now too, their calls mingling with the smell of incense and dried fish, and in stories, whispered from grandfather to grandchild, the name Srivijaya lived on, not as a map-bound kingdom, but as an idea, a golden place where the seas met, where faiths touched hands, where the world once came together in peace. Even as centuries passed, travellers spoke of it with a kind of reverence. It was the place before the present, the root beneath the leaves. A memory, yes, but one that shaped futures. The modern world, with its cities and satellites, was still built upon the bones of that ancient port. Its legacy moved not through swords but syllables, through stories, not statues. Srivijaya had once ruled the waves, but now it drifted, softly, beautifully, into legend, a port not an empire, but perhaps that was enough, perhaps it was everything. Chapter 13. The Hidden Temples. There comes a moment after all the noise has passed when the world exhales. The drums fall silent. The ships no longer sail. The markets close. And in that silence, the forest listens and slowly begins to reclaim. Centuries after Srivijaya's light had dimmed, long after its kings had been forgotten and its ports quieted, travellers arrived in Sumatra again, not with maps or armies, but with curiosity. What they found was not a thriving kingdom, but echoes, vines tangled around walls that once guarded libraries, roots coiled around the feet of statues that had watched generations pass. And in the stillness of green and shadow, worn Buddhas sat, eyes closed, untouched by time, but softened by it. The jungle had crept in gently, not as an invader, but as a blanket. What the world had left behind, nature chose to cradle. Stone paths were buried under fallen leaves. Stupas leaned gently, as if bowing to the earth that held them. Some shrines were barely visible, their rooftops peeking above moss-covered ground, like memories refusing to be buried entirely. These were not places of grandeur anymore. They did not glitter. There was no gold, no incense, no chanting monks. But still, they were sacred. Every vine seemed to whisper. Every leaf held the hush of prayers once spoken. The air here was thick with more than moisture. It was heavy with memory. One could walk for hours and not see another soul. Only the carved faces of ancient gods, half hidden behind ferns, still watching. The forest had taken back the empire's forgotten corners, but it had done so gently, not to destroy, but to protect. And beneath this veil of green, something sacred still breathed. Muaro Jambis, silent monks. Along the winding stretch of the Batanghari River in eastern Sumatra lies a place few outside. The region had heard of Muaro Jambi, but long before it fell into silence, this land once pulsed with life, ritual, and wisdom. Here, scattered across nearly 12 square kilometers of soft, fertile land, lay over 80 temple mounds, brick structures, tucked beneath centuries of soil and root. To the untrained eye, they may have once looked like hills or natural ridges, but beneath those mounds, brick by ancient brick, stood the bones of something sacred, a massive complex of monasteries, learning halls and shrines, a center of Buddhist study, a spiritual lighthouse for the Srivijaya world. Unlike the towering stone temples of Java or Angkor, Muaro Jambi's temples were humble in appearance. Built from red brick, modest in scale. But their number, their layout, and their silence told another story. They were not for show, they were for seekers. In its time, Muaro Jambi might have drawn scholars from across the region, from India, from mainland Southeast Asia, even from China. It was likely a seat of Mahayana Buddhism, rich in scripture and thought, echoing with the soft chants of monks in saffron robes. Here, teachings may have been copied onto palm leaves, debates may have been held beneath fig trees, the air once thick with incense, the ground worn smooth by countless barefoot steps. But when the tides of history turned, Muaro Jambi did not resist. It closed its doors without protest. The monks left, or perhaps simply faded. The jungle began its slow embrace. and for centuries no voice rose here. Only the wind. Today, as archaeologists brush away layers of earth, they uncover more than brick. They touch silence, a silence built over time, sacred in its patience. The monks may be gone, but the temples remain, sleeping, dreaming Mwaro Jambi, never asked to be found. But in being forgotten, it preserved something that noise never could: stillness. Whispered prayers in stone. In every civilization, there comes a time when voices fall silent, but stone remembers. In the overgrown ruins of Srivijaya's sacred spaces, not just in Mwaro Jambi, but scattered across Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, remnants of prayer still linger. Carvings, once precise, now softened by weather, still tell stories. A lotus motif, a seated Buddha, a symbol of the Dharma wheel carved with steady hands long ago. These were more than decorations, they were offerings. Each chisel mark a kind of devotion, each pattern a meditation set in clay. Walk slowly through these spaces and you begin to feel them. Not just see them, feel them. The curve of a broken stupa beneath your hand. The faint outline of a bodhisattva hidden behind moss. The way sunlight, when it breaks through the canopy just right, touches the top of a forgotten shrine like a benediction. The temples no longer echo with chants, but their silence is not empty. It is full, full of waiting, full of remembering. It holds within it the voices of countless monks, pilgrims and kings who once knelt here, who once lit lamps and bowed heads and asked questions not of the world, but of the soul. Stone does not forget. And in Srivijaya's sacred spaces, the prayers are not erased, only hushed. Even in decay, the bricks do not collapse. They lean, they weather, they erode. But they endure, like a whisper that never needed to be loud to be heard. The sacred stillness. There are ruins that mourn, cracked and abandoned, reminders of power lost. But Srivijaya's temples do not mourn. They wait, they do not cry for the return of empires, nor do they seek the footsteps of kings. What they hold is deeper, a sacred stillness untouched by time or ambition. This stillness is not emptiness, it is presence, a waiting that does not expect, a breath held in eternity. Those who visit these places often speak of a calm they can't explain, as though the very ground understands something we have forgotten, as if the trees that grow through the old courtyards are not intruders, but guardians, as if the silence itself is holy. Srivijaya is long gone, its ports have changed names, its influence has scattered like petals in wind. But these temples, covered in vines, sunken in earth, kissed by rain, are still here. They are not symbols of loss, they are reminders of a time when wisdom mattered more than war, when faith was built not just in stone, but in silence, when people believed that the divine could be touched, not with gold, but with reverence, and maybe, in that stillness, we can find something again. Not Srivijaya itself. That time has passed, but the feeling, the humility, the peace. For some empires leave behind treasures, others leave behind temples. But Srivijaya, in its gentle exit, left behind stillness. And sometimes, that is the most sacred thing of all. Chapter 14. Legends on the Wind. There are stories the sea carries longer than any scroll. Stories without ink or paper, kept alive in breath and breeze, retold by the rhythm of waves and the whispers of sails. Along the coasts of Sumatra, where the salt air tangles with smoke from morning fires, such stories have never truly died. For centuries after Srivijaya's name had faded from palaces and parchment, it lived on in the mouths of those who knew the sea best: fishermen, boat builders, pearl divers, and spice traders. They didn't speak of emperors or treaties. They didn't quote inscriptions or dates. Instead, they spoke of an ancient queen who could calm storms with a glance, of harbours where no tolls were taken, only respect offered, of ships so grand their sails looked like thunderclouds. These tales had no chapter headings, no scholars to defend them, but they were remembered in quiet villages where the wind still smells of brine. Old men speak of the days when rulers rode the tides, not the roads. They speak of a time when the sea was a realm, and Srivijaya its crown. Children growing up near these coasts still hear these tales, not in classrooms, but in lullabies, in fishing songs, in the careful way nets are cast and anchors drop. They're told to show reverence to the sea, not just for its danger, but for its memory. No one remembers exactly when these stories began, but that is their power. They did not start in one place or time. They rose like mist from the ocean itself, shaped by hands hauling in nets and voices singing against the wind. In the rhythm of the tides, Srivijaya was never truly gone. It had simply changed form. From empire to echo, from history to myth. Songs of Srivijaya, far from the ruins and forgotten capitals in places untouched by stone or script, Srivijaya still breathed. In song, in the highlands of Sumatra, in the coastal villages of Borneo, even in the scattered settlements of the Riau Islands, ballads could be heard on quiet nights. Sung by candlelight or under full moons, they told of ships with golden hulls, their decks lined with princes whose eyes glowed like stars. They sang of monks who travelled without walking, whose prayers floated across water, whose silence could cure fevers. The names changed from place to place. Some called the prince Dewa Raja. Others spoke of Putri Laut, the sea princess, said to have ruled the waves with kindness and steel. But the heart of the stories remained, a memory of greatness, kindness, mystery, and power. These weren't songs for kings or courts. They were sung by women weaving mats, by grandmothers putting children to sleep. They weren't written down, they didn't need to be. They moved through generations like wind through palm leaves. One ballad tells of a ship that never returned, not because it sank, but because it sailed so far it reached the land of the gods. Another speaks of a bell that rang across the ocean, guiding lost fishermen home. There were songs that warned, too, of forgetting one's roots, of failing to give thanks to the sea, of losing the sacred thread of memory. These weren't just stories, they were guidance, comfort, and prayer. And they tell us something history books often forget, that not all legacies are built in stone. Some live in voice and in the soft spaces between silence. More than stone, we often search for the past in ruins. Broken columns, weathered statues, names etched in fading scripts. But Srivijaya's truest legacy did not settle in brick or bronze. It lived in movement, in ritual, in rhythm, in the way sails are cut to catch the monsoon winds, in the quiet blessing a captain murmurs before pushing off from the shore, in the offerings of rice and fruit placed at the bow before the first voyage of the season. These gestures, simple, almost invisible, are not modern habits, they are echoes. Ask a boatmaker in Palembang why he shapes the stern in that exact curve, and he may shrug. "It's how my grandfather did it," he'll say. And yet, that curve mirrors the ships carved on Srivijaya's ancient seals. In southern Sumatra, when harvests are good, villages gather to perform dances that stretch back centuries. Their steps, their chants, the very fabric of their garments, they carry symbols older than memory. Srivijaya does not appear in the lyrics, but it is there, in the flow, in the form. Even the language holds traces. Words for ocean, for journey, for monk, they carry hints of Sanskrit woven into Malay like threads in cloth, not imposed, not explained, simply lived. There is a kind of beauty in this survival, not in monuments, not in grand declarations, but in the ordinary, in how people walk, speak, sail, give thanks. Srivijaya was not lost. It became breath. It became ritual. It became the unseen hands that guide the living without demanding recognition. And in that way, it endured longer than empires ever planned. The myth that refused to die. For centuries, Srivijaya vanished from history books. European explorers, colonial scholars, few mentioned it. Some doubted it had ever existed at all. There were no towering citadels, no grand libraries, no Rome or Angkor to point to and say, "Here it stood." But Srivijaya did not need marble to remember itself. The myth survived, not in universities, but in kitchens, not in archives, but in boats. It refused to die. When scholars finally pieced together its fragments in the 20th century, from Chinese records, from old stone inscriptions, from whispered songs that had never been written down, they realized something remarkable. Srivijaya had not simply been an empire, it had been an idea, a current, a pattern of life that had moved through people, places and time like water through roots. And as they dug through ruins and translations, they found what the fishermen and singers had always known, that this empire had lived in the hearts of its people more than in any palace. Srivijaya, the forgotten empire, had been waiting. It waited through centuries of silence, through the rise and fall of other kingdoms, through the coming of new faiths, new rulers, new languages. It waited in the way a mountain waits, not needing to be seen to still exist. And when its name finally returned to books and voices, it did not return with fanfare. It returned with quiet certainty, like a tide rising. Now travelers come to see the remnants, the mounds, the bricks, the carvings. They read about the trade routes, the monks, the kings. But perhaps the real discovery is quieter. Perhaps it lies in the way the wind still moves across the Malacca Strait, in the way old men tell stories to wide-eyed children, in the way myths persist, not because they are written, but because they are lived. Srivijaya never disappeared. It simply waited for us to remember. Chapter 15. Rediscovering the Lost Empire. There are moments in history when the past whispers so quietly, only the patient can hear it. In the 19th century, as colonial powers moved across Southeast Asia, measuring lands and redrawing borders, a few European scholars began noticing strange patterns, things that didn't quite fit. They weren't looking for empires. Most of them were linguists, missionaries, or administrators. Their work involved dusty manuscripts, half-crumbled temples, and long-forgotten languages. But slowly, from those fragments, a name began to appear. Not in bold, not in triumph, but quietly, like a ship seen far off in the mist. In a cave in Sumatra, an inscription was found. The script was ancient, Sanskrit but local. It told of a king who called himself a protector of the Dharma. Then, far away, in southern Thailand, another stone was uncovered, speaking of a place called Srivijaya, a name no one had heard before. More fragments surfaced, in Java, in the Malay Peninsula, even in dusty Chinese records translated by scholars in Europe. Each one offered a piece, but no one knew what the whole looked like. At the time, colonial historians had their gaze fixed elsewhere. They admired the temples of Angkor, the ruins of Borobudur, the grandeur of India's dynasties. But Srivijaya didn't leave behind monumental cities. It had sailed on waves and lived in ports. Its temples were brick, not marble. Its capitals had been reclaimed by jungle. To the colonial eye, it had vanished, but the clues kept surfacing, like driftwood after a storm. Each inscription, each ancient Chinese envoy's record, hinted at a kingdom once vast, powerful, and central to the seas, one that had somehow slipped through the cracks of written history. It was a mystery. And for a few determined scholars, mysteries were invitation. And so Srivijaya began to rise again, not from war, not from rebellion, but from stone and silence. George Quédès and the Clues. In the early 20th century, a French scholar named George Quédès sat at a desk in Bangkok surrounded by scrolls, photographs, rubbings of stone inscriptions, and books from every corner of Asia. He was not a conqueror, not a general, not a king, but what he uncovered would reshape our understanding of Southeast Asian history forever. Quédès had a gift, not just for language, but for connection. Where others saw isolated names and events, he saw threads waiting to be woven. From a stela in Sumatra to a temple inscription in Chaya, from old Chinese shipping records to dusty Sanskrit verses, he began to see the outlines of something massive, something hidden. Piece by piece, he stitched it together. A kingdom maritime in nature, Buddhist in soul, and vast in reach, stretching from the tip of Sumatra to the borders of Cambodia. He saw a network of ports, of learning centers, of influence spanning centuries. A name kept surfacing in many forms: Srivijaya, Sriwijaya, Javaka. Different tongues gave it different shapes, but the heart remained the same. By 1918, Quédès wrote of his theory with care and clarity. He did not declare conquest or discovery. He simply laid out the evidence, patient, respectful, astonishing. What he proposed was this: an empire had once ruled the seas of Southeast Asia, not with armies, but with trade, not with walls, but with water. He named it Srivijaya. In that moment, a veil lifted. The puzzle began to take form, and a lost empire, scattered across languages and lands, was given a voice again. Quédès never walked through a Srivijayan palace. He never found a throne. But he listened, to stone, to song, to stories that time had not completely silenced. His work did not rebuild the empire, but it made the world remember it had been there. And that is its own kind of resurrection. The puzzle of place. With Srivijaya's name restored, a new challenge began. Where exactly had it been? Scholars turned to maps, both ancient and modern, trying to trace a kingdom that had left few ruins and fewer borders. It was not easy. Srivijaya had not built a single grand capital like Angkor or Rome. Its strength lay in movement, in trade, in connection. It was an empire of waterways, not roads, a power measured by harbors, citadels. The inscriptions offered hints. They spoke of Palembang, of Jambi, of Kedah, of Chaya. Chinese records mentioned visits to a great port in the South Seas. Indian texts spoke of kings with golden thrones in Suvarnadvipa, the island of gold, but no map could pin it down with certainty. Some proposed that Srivijaya moved its heart as needed, following trade winds, avoiding threats, adapting like the ocean it ruled. Its capital may have been where the tides were kindest, where the ships were fullest, where peace could be bought without blood. This challenged everything the West had believed about empires. They expected capitals with walls, monarchs with palaces, armies with banners. But Srivijaya had left behind none of that, or at least none that remained above the forest floor. What it had left behind was harder to see, but perhaps more lasting. A shared culture stretching across the islands, a network of Buddhism, commerce, and language. A sense of identity that moved like water, flowing across Sumatra, through the straits of Malacca, touching Java, Borneo, and beyond. It became clear that Srivijaya's power had not been held in place. It had been held in people, in their beliefs, their rituals, their ways of building boats and temples, of chanting and trading. And so the maps were redrawn, not with hard lines, but with soft curves, to mark influence instead of borders, to mark presence instead of possession. Srivijaya had been hidden in plain sight all along, not in monuments, but in memory. The memory rekindled. As the 20th century moved on, Srivijaya slowly stepped out of the shadows, not as a ruler to be feared, nor as a force to be reckoned with, but as a story to be remembered. Museums began to include its name. University courses spoke of its influence. Historians from Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and beyond took up the task of reclaiming their shared past. Srivijaya became more than a forgotten footnote. It became a symbol of unity, of movement, of spiritual and economic power that had once shaped the heart of Southeast Asia. Local pride blossomed. In Palembang, ceremonies revived the ancient name. Streets were renamed. Temples once left crumbling were restored. Schools began teaching the story of the empire that had ruled the waves. A sense of wonder returned, not just for what had been lost, but for what had survived in silence. But Srivijaya's legacy didn't return through grandeur. It returned through reverence. It returned in the way an old chant still echoes during Vesak celebrations, in the pattern of sails stitched in a certain shape, in the offerings placed before a journey across the sea. It returned because people remembered. In their bones, in their villages, in their faith, Srivijaya was not reborn as a kingdom. It was reborn as a rhythm, a memory, carried not in stone, but in wind, and in that way, it continues, floating softly across oceans, whispered between generations, rising again and again with the tide. Chapter 16. Srivijaya's Shadow in Modern Southeast Asia. There are names that vanish into history, and there are names that drift, quietly, softly, across centuries, like petals on the wind. Srivijaya is one of those names. Lost for a time, yes. Forgotten in books, left out of grand monuments, but never gone. It waited, not in stone, but in breath. Whispered in riverside villages, recalled in songs, rediscovered in stories. Today, the name Srivijaya echoes once more, not as a kingdom of conquest, but as a symbol of pride, of heritage, of shared roots across Southeast Asia. In Indonesia, the name lives in schools, streets, and universities. Srivijaya University in Palembang stands as a quiet monument to the region's past, not with high walls or ancient towers, but through knowledge, inquiry, and remembrance. In classrooms and lecture halls, students learn not only of Europe or the Middle East, but of the empires that once ruled their own shores, of a maritime realm that guided trade, taught peace, and honored faith. In Malaysia too, Srivijaya finds voice, in museums, in state-sponsored heritage campaigns, in festivals that remember the old ports and trading towns. The empire is invoked not as an ancient rival, but as a shared ancestor, part of the soil, the sea, and the soul of the region. In southern Thailand, the city of Chaya still remembers. There, beneath the golden stupas and aging temples, the memory of Srivijaya glows, quiet but warm. The temples bear its art, the prayers carry its influence. And even the land, shaped by centuries of Buddhist presence, speaks of a time when this far-flung place was part of something vast and connected. The name Srivijaya no longer rules seas or commands fleets, but it floats on signs, in songs, in stories told by parents to children. It has returned not as a crown, but as a current, moving gently through the modern world, reminding nations who they once were and what they still carry. Palembang.
Reimagined Palembang, a city of traffic and movement, of bridges and market sounds. On the surface, it seems like any modern Southeast Asian city, concrete, bustle, progress. But beneath the steel and glass, something older stirs, because
this is where it began, where Srivijaya first breathed. The Musi River still runs through the heart of Palembang. Wide and brown, its waters twist like memory, slow and steady remembering. Boats still pass each other on its surface, though now they carry goods in, plastic packaging, not bundles of silk or jars of spice. The rhythms have changed, but the current is the same. Walk the streets of Palembang, and you may not see ruins. There are few grand temples or city walls, but the spirit of empire is there, in the language, in the way people gather by the riverbanks in the cool of evening, in the stories shared over tea. There is pride here, not loud, not boastful, but deep. Locals know they walk on ground once, honored by kings, once visited by monks, once watched by eyes from far-off lands, and they keep that history alive in festivals like the Musi Festival, which celebrates both the river and the city's timeless role as a hub of connection. Artists draw on Srivijaya's motifs. Dancers reenact scenes of trade and prayer. Even urban planners speak of weaving history into the city's future, restoring temples, naming parks, honoring the past, not in nostalgia, but in continuity. Palembang does not live in Srivijaya's shadow. It walks alongside it, a living place carrying an ancient pulse. The empire may have vanished, but the city endures. And in every ripple of the river, the past flows forward. Threads in a broader weave. Srivijaya was never alone. It did not rise in isolation, nor did it rule in a vacuum. It was part of something larger, a shimmering web of connections stretching across the Indian Ocean and deep into the Asian continent. Its monks studied in Nalanda, one of India's greatest centers
of learning.
Its traders docked in the harbors of Mecca, bearing spices, resins, and gold. Its messages reached Chang'an, the Chinese capital, where emperors welcomed envoys bearing tribute and tales from the southern seas. And it watched, perhaps even learned from, the rise of Angkor to the north, another empire of brilliance and belief. Srivijaya's strength was not in walls or weapons. It was in the way it moved. It gathered from many places and gave back in kind. From India, it took language and liturgy. From China, diplomacy and trade. From the Arab world, goods and glimpses of a new spiritual wind. From the islands around it, strength, support, and shared culture. It helped define a regional identity, one that was not just about power, but about openness, about learning and adaptation, about weaving many threads into one beautiful fabric. Even now, scholars marvel at how interconnected the ancient world was. Srivijaya's influence can be found in temple architecture, in trade routes, in rituals, still practiced today. It was part of a conversation, a long, flowing exchange of ideas, beliefs, and goods that shaped what we now call Southeast Asia. To study Srivijaya is to study a world without borders, one where rivers and coastlines mattered more than kingdoms, where the sea was not a divider but a bridge, where empires rose not from isolation but from embrace. And in that wider weave, Srivijaya still holds its place, not as the brightest thread perhaps, but one that binds. The sea remembers history, fades, temples fall, inscriptions wear thin, but the sea remembers. Every sailor who looks to the horizon, every fisherman who casts his net, every family that prays for safe passage, they tap into something older than maps, something deeper than names. Srivijaya lives in those moments. In the soft offerings made before a voyage, a flower, a whisper, a coin tossed into the tide, there is remembrance. Not always conscious, not always named, but felt. A gesture passed down through generations, rooted in rituals older than memory. In coastal villages, songs still rise with the wind. They don't always say Srivijaya, but they speak of kingdoms. Beneath the waves of ships guided by stars, of sea queens who protect the honest and punish the cruel. These are not new stories, they are old ones reshaped, retold. The boats themselves, or their shape, their wood, their painted eyes, are echoes, designs passed from father to son, never questioned, always used. They are part of a language the sea still speaks. And so, while Srivijaya may not stand on maps, while its kings no longer rule, while its palaces lie buried in soil, it endures, in tide and wind, in rhythm and song, in the silent respect given to the ocean even today, Because the sea does not forget. It carries everything, dreams, stories, legacies, tucked within its shifting waves. And every time a boat sets sail from the shores of Indonesia or Malaysia or Thailand, Srivijaya sails again. Chapter 17. The Empire That Sailed with the Stars. Before the names were lost, before the maps were drawn, before history picked its favorites, there was a rhythm to the sea, an understanding, quiet and vast, like the tide itself. Srivijaya did not begin as a fortress or a throne. It did not rise in the image of the great land empires. Instead, it emerged from the currents, born of wind, of water, and of motion. It was more than a kingdom, it was a philosophy. To live by the sea is to live with patience, with respect, with a heart tuned not to conquest but to movement. The rulers of Srivijaya understood this deeply. They did not build massive walls or
towering armies. They watched the stars, they studied the skies and tides.
They knew when to set sail, when to wait, and when to speak with silence. And so Srivijaya flourished, not through domination, but through alignment. It became a node in the world's great net of trade and spirit, not a barrier, but a bridge, not a gate, but a flow. Its harbors welcomed ships from India, Arabia, China. But more than that, they welcomed ideas. Languages crossed over like birds in migration. Beliefs interwove like the threads of silk offloaded from battered hulls. A chant from Nalanda might echo in a temple in Chaya. A verse from Mecca might be whispered in the markets of Jambi. To those who lived it, Srivijaya was not just a place, it was a way of being, a balance, a harmony between man and ocean, trade and prayer, the physical and the sacred. And when the sun dipped below the horizon and the sails were drawn for the night, they would sit in the soft quiet and listen to the sea, because that's where it all came from. That's where it all returned. The Dharma of the sea. Power in the landlocked world often meant conquest, marches, fortresses, flags staked into dirt. But Srivijaya held a different kind of strength, one shaped not by sword or steel, but by Dharma, by the path of balance. The empire's foundations were not cemented in conquest. They were floated upon trust, trade, and tolerance. At its heart was the sea, both giver and taker, gentle and fierce, never still, never fully tamed. And Srivijaya, rather than fight it, flowed with it. Its leaders did not seek to dominate others. Instead, they offered something rarer: stability. They kept the straits safe. They ensured that pilgrims could pass, that spices could sail, that cultures could meet without fear. In doing so, they wove a kind of spiritual economy where prayer and port, incense and ledger could share the same breath. Monasteries were built, not for show, but for seeking. The Buddhist Dharma, deeply Mahayana in tone, emphasized compassion, learning, and peace. These ideals mirrored the ocean itself, immense, embracing, mysterious. Srivijaya's ships carried not just pepper and camphor, but monks, scriptures, and dreams. When kings from the Indian subcontinent sent envoys, they came not to threaten, but to honor. When Chinese emperors mentioned Srivijaya in their court records, it was with respect, not for its armies, but for its spirit. This was an empire of soft power. of influence, not imposition, where knowledge was treasured more than gold, where belief was not forced but flowed. And in this quiet strength, in this Dharma of the sea, Srivijaya found its place in the story of the world. Lessons from a forgotten empire. Srivijaya does not decorate the walls of major museums. Its name is absent from many textbooks, its ruins are few, its records scattered, and yet its influence lingers. What can we learn from an empire that ruled not by sword, but by sail, that left behind few statues but countless stories? Perhaps the lesson is this: permanence is an illusion. Even stone erodes, even temples fall. But ways of life, when lived in rhythm with the world, can ripple far beyond their time. Srivijaya teaches us that the most powerful empires are not always the loudest. That legacy is not carved in marble, but in memory, in language, in custom, in the gentle rituals passed from hand to hand, a fisherman blessing his net with a whispered chant, a mother humming an old melody that once echoed through distant ports, a boat builder shaping the curve of a hull the way his ancestors did, not knowing it matches one carved on an ancient seal. These are the footprints Srivijaya left. Quiet, worn by time, but never gone, it also reminds us to look beyond borders, to see the sea not as a divide, but as a connection, to value openness over control, flow over force. Srivijaya's fall was not sudden. There was no single battle, no dramatic collapse. It simply receded, like the tide, leaving behind pearls for those who choose to see. And if we listen, really listen, we'll find that its wisdom still hums beneath the noise of the modern world. The ocean's final whisper. Picture it now. The sea is calm. The moon hangs, full and pale above the waves. A single boat drifts in the open water, its lantern swaying gently with the motion, its sail folded in rest. There is no sound but the soft lapping of the ocean against wood. No voices, no shouting, just the steady breath of the world, exhaled through stars and tide. This boat is Srivijaya. Not a monument, not a ruin, but a presence. Drifting forward, not vanished, only ahead of us. The story we've told of kings and ports, of monks and myths, of ruins and rediscovery, is not the story of a lost empire. It is the story of a living current, one that still moves beneath the surface of Southeast Asia, one that rises with the monsoon and returns with the rain. It is in the offerings at sea, in the quiet pride of Palembang, in the scholars who seek, in the children who still sing songs passed down from grandmothers who never read a history book, but knew something sacred when they heard it. Srivijaya was never about power. It was about presence, about knowing your place in the great rhythm of things, about sailing with the stars, not against them. And now, as we close this journey, not with a flag planted in soil, but with a whisper on water, remember this: some empires shout, but Srivijaya sails,